I'd like to thank you for coming out on this Dreek morning. My name is David Ware, and I am, depending upon who you ask, either the third or fourth most junior member of the staff of the Arkansas State Archives in terms of years of service. I'm afraid that in terms of mileage on the odometer, I'm at the other end of the ordinal spectrum, but they forgive me my jokes about 1960s and 70s culture. And don't you remember? No, we weren't born yet. And they allow me to occupy space there, for which I am thankful. Part of my job seems to be getting fingered to give introductory remarks, basically the warm-up. Get people in a nice, comfortable place and go forward. And I find myself on this topic wondering, what business do I have talking about anything connected to cemeteries or funerals or veneration rites or whatever? It's not my background. I am not a cultural anthropologist. I am not descended from undertakers either. Instead, I'm an historian who spent most of his professional work looking at the culture of alcohol in the American Southwest. Of course, could you say that has a sort of a mortal tendency over time? But at any rate, I've long had a sort of a fondness for cemeteries, largely because they're usually the quietest place you can find in order to sit and relax and read and think, or occasionally even surreptitiously break a ukulele out of a case. And nobody's going to complain about you playing ukulele as long as there's not a service going on nearby. I confess that the whole business of cemeteries was not a topic that occupied much of my attention when I was younger. It's funny, though, how the accumulation of mileage on one's odometer sharpens one's focus a little bit. And having frequented cemeteries occasionally over the years and having basically grazed looking at the inscriptions on markers in the cemeteries left me to wonder, okay, who speaks for the dead? After all, you go to a cemetery, you find all sorts of improving words, comforting words, and so forth. There is a tradition, or at least an occurrence, of people trying to, in fact, speak for themselves after they are gone, in the form of leaving their desired tombstone inscriptions for their inheritors to either respect or disregard as they see fit. As an example of this, I submit Exhibit A for the morning, epitaphs contributed to the old Vanity Fair magazine. Back in the 1920s, by then prominent people, the smart set, the people who were the wits, the composers, the cultural elite of the United States back during the Roaring '20s. Some of these self-penned epitaphs were collected for an article in the Old American Heritage magazine, featured in the special 1920s issue, 112 pages of hardcover early nostalgia for the long past era, which appeared in 1965. You know, looking back at the 1920s as antique times, 45 years down. Okay, folks, that's stretching it a little bit. But at any rate, the last page of that issue, which I remember because my Aunt Mary Catherine, who used to take me out to Arlington Cemetery when I was a little kid to visit my grandfather out there, had bought our family a subscription to this lovely middle-brow history magazine. You had good academic historians and good amateurs throwing in great pictures, hardcover. It was respectable. It wasn't some cheesy magazine you picked up on the street corner. At the end of every issue was a sort of a wry commentary or something humorous from the press of the past. And for the Roaring '20s issue, I recall, they had a selection of these self-penned obituaries from Vanity Fair. Some seem to have been intended to be silly. Case in point, Dorothy Parker, who wrote Sigit, that is, here lies Dorothy Parker, excuse my dust. Now, Mrs. Parker would not, in fact, die until 1967, 2 years after the appearance of this reprint of her whimsical epitaph. In her will, Dorothy Parker, a fine poet, a superb short story writer, and one of the best critics of American literature and popular culture who ever came down the pike. She had hydrochloric acid in her veins, and it would come out through the pen very nicely. In her will, though, Dorothy Parker left her entire estate to Martin Luther King Jr. in support of the civil rights movement, though they had never met. When Dr. King was assassinated a year later, his estate, as well as Parker's, went to the NAACP. Parker's cremated remains, however, long lingered in a New York mortuary because the executor of her estate, Lillian Hellman, another interesting literary figure, refused to pay the mortuary. And so they sat on the shelf until the 1980s. They were left unclaimed when finally they were trying to get rid of them, and the NAACP said, "We'll take them," and interred them on the grounds of their Baltimore, Maryland offices. And her marker on that modest interment bore what she had said in 1924 she wanted: "Excuse my dust." Cut ahead to 2019. The NAACP moved their headquarters, and Parker's grave was left behind, or was to be left behind. But the Dorothy Parker Society appealed to the NAACP to allow her remains to be moved to New York, where her family had a burial plot waiting for her. The NAACP agreed, the family rejoiced, and her new headstone was installed. It bears a longer but related inscription, taken from one of her collections of verse that is not as light as it seems. "Leave for her a young red rose, go your way and save your pity. She is happy, for she knows that her dust is very pretty." Others from that Vanity Fair feature: "Here lies Michael Arlen, as usual." Or some went for brief drollery. "Here lies Alexander Woollcott." Anybody remember him? Okay. The man who had nothing to say but said it wonderfully amusingly. Alexander Woollcott, who died at the age of 92. He never had imitation fruit in his bathroom. By the way, Alexander Woollcott only made it to the age of 57. When he died, his ashes were to be sent to his alma mater, Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, for burial. Instead, they were sent to Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. They were eventually forwarded to Hamilton College. Alexander Woollcott arrived at his final resting place with 67 cents postage due. Other Vanity Fair funereal quips from these wits have stuck with me over the years. W.C. Fields' famous line, "I would rather be living in Philadelphia," was one that appeared in Vanity Fair, which was not, by the way, inscribed on his grave marker located in Hollywood's Forest Park. Or the brilliant then-young violinist Jascha Heifetz, who predicted that he would be, quote, "killed in action by a flying staccato, aged 23 years, 7 months, 30 days. So here are lying his remains. No more concerts, no more trains." Heifetz, by the way, lived to the ripe age of 86, teaching several generations of rising violinists. He died in 1987. 20 years before, in 1967, Jascha Heifetz had converted his Renault car to run on battery power for environmental reasons, by the way. Not just the towering violinist of the 20th century, but also somebody who was green before it was cool. The thing is that with the exception of Parker's first epitaph, none of the people who specified what they wanted on their tombstones actually got their wishes, suggesting that it may be rash for individuals to try to dictate what their survivors say about them on stone or brass. Although Dorothy Parker, yeah, even her replacement tombstone came pretty close to her original stated intention. But the question remains then, if the dead can't speak for themselves, who shall speak for the dead? One's family, one's friends, whoever chisels the letters and words and ornaments into the stone or wood or brass of the grave marker. And sometimes this service is performed memorably. Case in point, and here we go back to a little bit of personal history. 1968, the cathedral town of Winchester in Hampshire, England, the capital of the old Wessex kingdom. My parents were there on an antiques buying spree, and I was left to wander. And so I did, onto the grounds and into the sanctuary of Winchester Cathedral, this glorious, not terribly high-spired, but architecturally interesting pile. There are flying buttresses there, but in good English fashion, the flying seems to be within 6 inches of the ground. It's a solid place that is glorious on the inside. I went inside, I looked around, and I noticed, this is the first time I've been in one of these here English-style cathedrals, and I noticed that there were a bunch of grave markers in the floor. It was hard not to step on the remains of somebody. Somehow I managed to miss the most famous grave marker in Winchester Cathedral, that of Jane Austen. Jane Austen, who died young, who had not quite achieved the fame that her novels would actually earn her after her death. But you have a very pious epitaph on the grave marker here, plus a big brass plaque on the wall that was paid for with proceeds from the biography of her put out by her family some years, which kind of tidied up Aunt Jane's rough edges and sharp tongue a little bit, but hey, she had no control of it over that point. I plumb missed this, I confess. I had not read Persuasion by that time. I won't miss it the next time I visit. But I digress. At that time, Winchester Cathedral and its grounds were the subject of a multi-year archaeological project directed by Professor Martin Biddle of Hertford College, Oxford. After wandering around the cathedral and going ooh and ah, I wandered out onto the grounds and I was fascinated as I watched these people who I thought were all senior members of a profession that I had had no acquaintance with up to this point working. I realized now they were unpaid graduate students doing a summer gig under Professor Biddle's tutelage. They were uncovering the bones of ancient Winchester and the priory that had been once there. I now know them to have been graduate students. I also am grateful for the fact that they were generous with their time. They were uncovering the layers of historic, even archaic Winchester. And adjacent to the digging was the cathedral's churchyard. So I wandered around. I'd seen some interesting stuff on the floor inside the cathedral. I wandered around and I came across a good-sized headstone. And here is what it said. In memory of Thomas Thetcher, a grenadier of the North Regiment of Hampshire Militia, who died of a violent fever contracted by drinking small beer when hot, the 12th of May, 1764, aged 26 years. In grateful remembrance of whose universal goodwill towards his comrades, this stone is placed here at their expense as a small testimony of their regard and concern. Here sleeps in peace a Hampshire grenadier, who caught his death by drinking cold small beer. Soldiers, be wise from his untimely fall, and when you're hot, drink strong or none at all. This memorial being decayed, it was restored by the officers of the garrison in 1781. An honest soldier never is forgot, whether he die by musket or by pot. The stone was replaced by the North Hampshire Militia when disembodied at Winchester on the 26th of April, 1802, in consequence of the original stone being destroyed, and then the last line down in the weeds, and again replaced by the Royal Hampshire Regiment in 1966. I took a picture of that stone, and later, in the cathedral's gift shop, I found a postcard of it. It was an older photograph because it lacked that last line. This had obviously been done before the most recent replacement. Over the years, this grave marker stuck in my memory. I kept that photograph and that postcard floating around for years. My photograph of it disappeared. The postcard eventually did too, but I found a copy of the same postcard online. Obviously, it had been something celebrated because so many people had wanted it over the years. It was a story that stuck with me. Never underestimate the power of a good story set on stone. Many years later, I discovered that it had stuck with someone else. In 1918, a young American soldier named Bill Wilson, who was encamped near Winchester with his U.S. Army unit while en route to the Western Front, visited the cathedral and chanced upon Thomas Thetcher's grave. Wilson was struck by the inscription and also by the similarity between Thetcher's name and that of a boyhood friend. Wilson survived the war. He was one of the late American entries, and he got lucky. He came back, he became a successful businessman, but also he became what in my family we call a drunk. Heavy drinking marred his career. He was eventually told he'd either end up dead or in an asylum because of his drinking habits. But there was a third path. Wilson and a handful of fellow boozers discovered a way to achieve sobriety. Wilson was, of course, the famous Bill W., one of the fathers of Alcoholics Anonymous. And on the first page of chapter 1 of the big book, he recalled his visit to Winchester Cathedral as a doughboy and how the gravestone had caught his eye, describing it as an ominous warning which I failed to heed. Well, it's good that he remembered the gravestone. He took something away from it. Clearly, though, he had misunderstood the part of the inscription which read, "When you're hot, drink strong or none at all." He'd focused on the fact that the man had been drinking something. But there's more to the story. I'll get to it in a second. I encountered that story in my father's copy of the big book. I don't know that it influenced my choice of research topics in graduate school, but there's no telling. Something about alcohol may have lodged in my head. But from that study, I figured out something. Never underestimate the power of a good story etched on stone. Now, as I say, I think that Bill W. missed or misunderstood or chose to ignore part of the story that's on that stone. My best guess is that Thomas Thetcher was not what we would call an alcoholic. He was in fact drinking the very temperate near beer, the common drink of the masses in 18th and 19th century Europe, in fact much of the United States. Small beer, won't go to the scary bit just yet. Small beer was a weak brew usually made at home by so-called alewives. 1/2 to maybe 2 or 2.5% alcohol maximum, sometimes almost as thick as porridge, depending upon whether or not they bothered to strain it. The idea was you basically cooked your mash for as long as 3 hours and then let it ferment. And quite honestly, small beer was slightly healthier than river water, plain water, which contained all sorts of nastiness, whether pulled from a well or a river, cholera, typhoid, other diseases, you know, the good stuff that kept people from getting too old and settled in their ways back in the good old days. Small beer was supposed to be scalded, as I say, for up to 3 hours. A recipe from George Washington's plantation gives us this reminder: scald it for 3 hours, by which time you would suppose that anything nasty in there would be killed off. But my bet is that especially in firewood poor England of the 18th century, the temptation to not cook it quite as long would have been very strong, especially if you're a poor woman trying to make some small beer to sell to the soldiers. And so a few corners were cut. It wasn't cooked long enough, and so it stayed remarkably contagious. And so I would say that the violent fever that killed poor Thomas Thetcher off was caused by one of these diseases which had not been killed off during the brewing process. Ironically, had Thomas Thetcher drunk strong beer, which had a higher alcoholic content and was made generally in semi-commercial breweries, a higher alcoholic content, probably 5 to 6%, maybe even more, made with a little more care, he probably would have survived. But I digress. Who speaks for the dead? The words on the grave markers, preserved or fading, obscure in meaning, or simple and direct. These are stories, even if they are very short ones, even if they are incomplete ones, even if they are misleading ones, they're stories that leave us to try to puzzle out the rest of the tale. They don't tell all there was or is about someone, but they form one handle, one access, one data point, if you will, from which to proceed in search of others, to puzzle out personal histories, to puzzle out family histories, to puzzle out institutional histories. And they can embody, in the care that is taken of them, the care that the descendants of those who lie in them take of their ancestors, some indication of the respect with which the dead are held in a society. In a couple of days, On El Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, on many a grave around the country, there will appear tangible signs of such care, of such attempts to commune with the dead and keep their memory alive. These ofertas, built on or near graves or built in houses to commemorate those who have gone, remind us that if we would speak for ourselves after we have gone, maybe we might want to leave something behind us in addition to what goes on that marker. Thank you very much, and my remarks are concluded. Better and more graceful speech will follow. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Abby Burnett, obsessed with tombstones, and I am here to talk about lies a tombstone told me. I learned something recently. I had known that hearsay is not admissible in court because you can't cross-examine the person who said it. It's gossip. It's repeated. But what I learned recently is there's something called the exceptions to the rule against hearsay. And item number 13 on this long list is information found carved on a tombstone, because it is argued that a tombstone has no reason to lie. Now, if you spend any time at all in a cemetery, you know how absurd that is. But in fact, there are a lot of ways tombstones can lie to us. This talk is on some of the ways I have found, but it's also, for the English majors in the audience, tombstones as unreliable narrators. Tombstones are telling us things that we really can't trust. So I break lies down into categories. I mean, obviously, obvious whoppers would be one, but also something called character rehabilitation. You have a relative who did something you're not very proud of. So on that person's tombstone, you talk about what a great person they were at great lengths. That's a little suspicious. Another type of lie would be an uncorrected mistake. Something's clearly wrong, but it was never fixed. And again, the outright whoppers. So why do we have to say good things on tombstones? Why do we, with character rehabilitation? I think it comes down to something like this. This is Dr. Grigsby, and his marker says on it, "Say nothing but good of the dead." We have a taboo against saying anything bad about someone who has died. And that leads us to going overboard when the person's character is a little sketchy. Now, there's an exception to the say nothing but good of the dead taboo, and that is when the dead says something bad about themselves. Or the pre-dead, let's say. When a person buys a tombstone pre-need and says something bad on it about themselves, that would be an exception. So I'm going to give some examples. I don't actually have people's permission to use their tombstones, so I've taken their names off. But in this case, we have a husband and wife. The wife dies first, and she's, beloved, wife, mother, best friend, but he is feared or hated by most. Still alive, so he got the final word here. Another example is this family. The wife is, again, devoted wife and mother, and the husband is... Now, he's in the phone book, and I really should call and ask him, but I can't bring myself to. I just don't know how to have that conversation. Excuse me. This woman is sleeping with the angels, but the back of her stone says, "I thought I was too mean to die." So she gets to have it both ways, apparently. And then my favorite example of all is Wayne Everett Strickland. Now, he and his wife have got matching markers that they put up pre-need. He's an atheist, and he says, "I'm a busy man, I don't have time for this." Now, here's the thing. I went back a few years later, and by golly, he does now have time, presumably, if he means death. But the back of his marker is identical to the front. Same picture, the same word atheist, same inscription, except there's no death date. So I think it's like Schrodinger's tombstone. He's both alive and dead. But he gets to have it both ways. So now I want to talk about true character rehabilitation. This is where the person did something and the family picks out a stone that just goes overboard. And I can't explain this sign in the cemetery, but I really love it. So the first example is here in Little Rock. This is on Solon Borland Blackburn's marker, and I'm indebted to Ronald Fuller for having transcribed this massive amount of verbiage. Solon Borland, well, let me just start with what it says about him. It says he He was our beloved child, affectionate, obedient in infancy, noble, generous in manhood, the very soul of honor and worth. And he may have been, but here's how he ended up. Solon Borland, SB, in the newspapers, was engaged to a young woman who broke the engagement, and she did so in a letter in which she said that until his habits improved, he was discarded. And his habits were that he was a very bad alcoholic. And so for the next 2 years, instead of working on his addiction, he just got worse. He drank more and more until finally, on December 17th of 1876, he took her letter out of his pocket, wrote "Try and forget me" on the bottom, and shot himself in the head. Now, oddly enough, he was in New Orleans at the time. His father lived in New Orleans, but his brother Charles apparently was the one who came and retrieved the body and brought him to Little Rock for burial. So there's more about his virtues. God bless God bless you. I can't read from here, but you can see it. It goes on and on. And then at the very bottom, this is all from a letter written to the father. And so apparently the father did not see his son again. But Charles, and it says so in very tiny letters from a letter written to his father, basically says, "Because of my brother, I looked on his face, I no longer am afraid to die." That was a kind of a stand, actually that's on other stones. But because of the expression on his face, I no longer am afraid of dying. My last look at his brave face was for his noble father as I gazed upon his features, and so forth and so forth. So that was Solon's story. More extreme, one of the Hamby brothers, who were lovely in life, according to their tombstone. I love the Hambys. They are buried near Boonville, between Boonville and Paris. And this is their tombstone. And if you notice, it says they were maliciously murdered. Now, Chalk was Robert, and William, have 2 Bible verses on the backs of their stones, and both Bible verses come down pretty heavily on the word persecuted. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and shall persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. That's Will's stone, and Chalk says, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So much persecution. And at the bottom of their stone it says, Chalk and Will were lovely in life, and in death were not divided. So this is a lot of persecution. So what did they do? Well, in 1881, they were friends with 2 young men named William Jetton and Bun Fuller. And the 2 of them apparently got into some kind of a fight with 2 black brothers named Leander and Emmett Logan. And the Logans swore out a warrant. They went to the sheriff and swore out a warrant against Jetton and Fuller. And so as not to be arrested, the 2 men went into hiding. Jetton and Fuller went into hiding. And after a few days of this, they said to themselves, our problems would just go away if we killed the Logans. But they didn't own any guns. Well, it happened that Chalk and Will Hamby were in the area. And so the 2, Jetton and Fuller, borrowed the Hambys' guns. And the Hambys knew full well what was going to be done with them, because they lingered in town and waited for the killing to be finished so they could go look at the bodies and maybe to get their guns back. But what happened was that Jetton and Fuller hid near the Petit Jean River, and somebody must have tipped off the Logans, or they just got lucky and took a different route going home. But they didn't pass by, and night fell, and pretty soon the Hamby brothers decide to go see the bodies, and they ride up, and they're killed by their friends with their own guns. Now, the newspapers covered all of this in great detail. First, the Logans were suspected of the killing and were arrested, but were released because they had a good alibi. And then somehow Jetton and Fuller were accused, and they were put in jail, and they dug their way out and escaped and were not seen again for 5 years. In fact, Jetton was never seen again. But Fuller's father lived in the area, and eventually he came back and stood trial. And despite having having pled guilty originally, he was acquitted, probably because he could blame Jetton for it, and went on to live a good life. So the 2 Hamby brothers have quite the story. Now, 100 years later, the Boonville newspaper published an account, one of those looking back pages from the past, And they told the story, and they got most of the details right. They messed up on one little thing, but essentially they had all of the details. And a Hamby descendant came boiling into the newspaper office and demanded a retraction. And he said, none of this is true. This is an old wives' tale. In fact, there was a crazed renter of property who killed the brothers and escaped, and all of our proof burned up in a house fire. So the Boonville paper published an abject apology. But the fact is, in the 1880s, all of this was written about. Another example of character rehabilitation is John Coleman Pointer. Oh, I love this guy. For years, I have been arguing with people in Eureka Springs. They have this stone on their cemetery tour, and they say that it's a broken obelisk because people hated Pointer so much that they rose up in fury and they smashed his marker. Now, the broken obelisk simply represents a life cut short by death. And Pointer's was cut short by a noose because he was hanged by Judge Parker as marshals and hangman for a grisly crime. But in fact, as I researched John Pointer, I would have smashed his marker too if I'd had a chance. John Pointer was probably a sociopath from a very young age. And to boil this way down, whenever he got in trouble in Eureka, his father bought his way out, paid, did whatever he could, and John never really learned a lesson from this. Well, in 1891, John was up in Missouri stealing horses, and that alone could get you killed. And so he gets back to Eureka Springs just ahead of the law, and his father gets his son out of town. He knows that two local men, Ed Vanderveer and William Bolding, are about to leave for Texas to pick cotton. So he pays their traveling expenses if they will take John with them, and they do. It's a bad mistake. They all go off to Texas, they pick cotton, and at some point John wanders off and gets into even more trouble. We don't know what, but the paper said he was in trouble. He comes back in December, and his friends have already headed back to Eureka Springs. They've got their money from picking the crop, and they're heading home. So he follows them on foot. He's not very far behind. And the day after Christmas, December 26, 1891, Vanderveer and Bolding's bodies are found in a ditch. Their heads have been smashed in from the back as they were sleeping. A bloody axe is found in a hollow tree. Their possessions are set on fire. Bolding was a cripple, so his crutch is smoldering in this fire. And their team of horses and their wagon are missing. And law enforcement can track the wagon to the nearest town, which is Oklahoma. And there is John Pointer living under an assumed name in a hotel, wearing the pants that belonged to William Bolding and carrying his pocket watch. He's also sold the wagon and team. He stands trial. This is, again, Judge Parker's court. And his alibi, his argument is that the two men were trying to kill each other, and he stepped in to stop them and somehow killed them both in the process. Didn't have a mark on him. Presumably any bloody clothing was burned up, but he was completely innocent. Well, again, his father stepped in and must have gotten him a very good lawyer, because for 2 years they fought this all the way to the Supreme Court, which declined to overturn the conviction. And John was hanged by Parker's marshals. He went to the scaffold sniveling and crying and saying, oh, if he hadn't taken poison that morning, he could bear it like a man, but he was hanged. His father brought his son's body back, and he put up this marker with this inscription: "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." I just want to say that after Pointer was hanged, a newspaper, Kansas City Times, said that Pointer apparently had always been a problem child. Pointer had been heartless, cruel, and cold-blooded as a boy. At school, he was a bully, cowardly and brutal. He, when quite a boy, bound a companion and attempted to burn him. So he tied up one of his schoolmates and tried to set him on fire. So this is somebody that was just in trouble his entire life, but greater love hath no man than this. My last example of character rehabilitation is The Doctor and the Dog in Helena. And this is a life-sized Irish setter carved on the grave of Dr. Emil Overton Moore, who died in February 16th, 1893. And the thing about this is, under the dog's paws, in big letters, is the word waiting. And if you walk around behind him, there's the word fidelity. So the dog is faithfully waiting. And in Helena, there are a number of stories. The dog is faithfully waiting for his owner to come home, apparently, come back. The dog has a collar carved around his neck. It says Pedro on it. I know there's a story here. I just can't find out more about it. But I do know that Dr. Emil Overton Moore's marker is covered in writing. In fact, somebody put a modern red granite base between the statue and the lower base, repeating all of the inscriptions. He is now beyond the reach of blame or praise, and love will hope, and faith will trust that he has felt the joy that is felt where there are no tears and no graves. And it gets better. Down here it says he was murdered, and the language underneath that says he possessed marked individuality. He was incapable of dissimulation, meaning he was incapable of lying. His errors were the errors of a man, and they stood out in bold contrast with the time-serving two-faced hypocrites who conspired to have him murdered. So, what really happened here? Well, the story is that Dr. Emil Overton Moore was a violent man. When he was drinking, which was often, people in Helena were afraid of him. In fact, it said that he was a terror when drunk. It also said, an early newspaper article said that he had gotten into several scrapes. I can't find out what these were. With one exception, he shot one of his patients point blank in the guts when the two argued over politics. And he was acquitted. So he was a violent man, but apparently a very skilled doctor. He and his brother had gone to medical school in Kentucky. And the story is that on this day, the day of the murder, Dr. Moore was probably out drinking, but a patient out in the country broke a leg. There's two versions. In any event, the patient needed a doctor, and the family either sent for the two doctors in town, or they sent for Moore who didn't show up, and then they sent for the other doctor, which is Dr. Chenault. Dr. Chenault arrived, set the patient's leg, or was beginning to treat the patient, when Moore arrived, mad as hell. And they started to argue. Now, the two doctors had gotten into a fight before this. There was some bad blood between them. And of course, Moore has a reputation. They decide not to argue over the patient, so they step out onto the front porch. The fight escalates, and at some point, Dr. Moore reaches into his jacket. And of course, Chenault is sure he's reaching for a gun. And Chenault pulls out his own gun and shoots Dr. Moore over the left eye, which Moore apparently had a premonition was going to happen, because his sister the next day told the newspapers that he had a premonition. But in any event, Dr. Chenault was acquitted because everybody knew what a violent man Dr. Moore was. Claiming self-defense would have been a very logical thing. But it gets better. Dr. Moore was estranged from his wife, and he had two very young children, a son 11 and a daughter, I think about 6. And he had taken them off of his life insurance as his beneficiaries. And he gave his life insurance to his mistress. She, Minnie Robertson, claimed to be his fiancée and said it was an early wedding present. The insurance company declined to pay us $5,000, which would be about $85,000 today. They said, well, he brought about his own death by fighting, but she successfully, after 3 attempts, did get the money. I don't think she paid for his tombstone. By then, she was living in St. Louis, and I think his wealthy parents very likely bought the Irish setter, probably in Memphis. So there's the close-up of his marked individuality and so forth. So the flip side of character rehabilitation is character embellishment. This is where you have a relative who was a very illustrious person, and you put up a modern marker and make them even better. I think this goes back to, if your grandmother tells you a family story, that you're a descendant of a Cherokee princess, you don't question grandma. You're a Cherokee princess. I think some of these modern markers are people taking a family legend and simply putting it on a new marker. So this man, for example, his family put this stone up over 100 years after he died, and it's loaded with all of his attributes. But they don't know where he's buried somewhere, and they don't know when he died, after 1830. And oh yes, he was a scout for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Let's just say that his name does not show up on any online account of the Lewis and Clark expedition, although a friend said to me once, well, maybe he pointed the way to the nearest tavern when they stopped in town. That we use carved in stone to mean something that is accurate, that is trustworthy, and that is really not true. Monument companies don't ask for proof. Anybody can carve anything on a marker. Oops, went the wrong way. And they do. This is John Carroll. He's also in Eureka Springs. He was a marshal. Unfortunately, he didn't get to hang Johnny Pointer, but he was a marshal briefly. His marker is modern and put there, I guess, within the past maybe 20 years. And I know you can't read it, but it is completely covered from top to bottom with this man's attributes. And a local genealogist told me that it contains a lot of mistakes. I didn't have to research very hard to find quite a few. John Carroll is the man in the middle. The boy with his hand on John's shoulder was his son Jefferson Davis, who was murdered in Kingston in 1881. He has a whole backstory. But John Carroll's marker is right next to his original stone. And his original stone was put there after he died. So his modern marker says he was born in Tennessee in 1826, and his original stone says he was born in Virginia in 1828. Now, maybe family did some research in the interim and found out, found him on more censuses and found out some more information about him, which would be fine. However, all the way down this long inscription are very questionable claims. One was that he was the first mayor of Eureka Springs. Well, he was the second mayor of Eureka Springs, but after he became mayor, they incorporated the city. So he was the first mayor under incorporation. Okay, I'll give them that one. He said he built the first real residence in Eureka. Well, not according to Eureka history. A judge did that. It has a lot of other things, but the real whopper comes at the very bottom, and it says, Carroll County was named for John Carroll. Well, John Carroll didn't even come to Arkansas from Missouri until the Civil War, and Carroll County has been in existence since statehood. And in fact, Carroll County was named for Charles Carroll of Maryland, who was an early signer of the Declaration of Independence. Charles Carroll signed the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and they named the town of Carrollton after him. So even Goodspeed, which would have been written more or less the time that John Carroll was living, doesn't claim that he was a descendant of the signer of the Declaration. Goodspeed said that he was probably a descendant of the Maryland and Tennessee Carrolls, which is a really big leap to now say the county was named for him. So there's an example of character embellishment, and I think it's just family pride that wants to put as many things as possible on a modern marker. Now, sometimes some lies are just uncorrected mistakes. Do you see a problem in this carving? The dead hand, the hand on the left, has got 6 fingers. Now, I don't know if the carver couldn't count. The carver had 6 fingers. The dead person had 6 fingers. It doesn't really matter. There are a lot of little mistakes on tombstones. The best ones, my favorite ones, of course, are the typos. Gone to be an angle. That one shows up a lot. We loved her, yes, we loved her, but the Angles loved her more. The lovely flower, the Calvary instead of cavalry on a Civil War marker, Bible verses misquoted, dead misspelled, and so forth. Lots of typos. I'm not saying those are lies. I'm just saying those are examples of places where carvers made mistakes. Carvers weren't always literate. Families weren't literate, and a family that's illiterate that tells a carver what to carve may not be able to read the resulting tombstone and see that there's a mistake. This is how carvers correct their mistakes. I am obsessed with a German carver named Nick Miller, and he did some really beautiful work in his early years. He was a very bad alcoholic, and as he progressed, his carving got a little sloppy, but this one he clearly messed up the family, the person's name. But this is how he fixed it. If you have raised letters and you can't change an R into a P, you've got to carve the stone away, and he just simply indented, which I think was a really clever way to fix it. Most carvers would simply remove the offending stone and carve in the divot. So Nick Miller carved the one on the right, the lamb, and he's made 2 mistakes apparently and had to carve them away and put a correction in. Modern markers, when they have mistakes, get corrected a different way, or they were for a while. When you have granite markers, at least for a while, monument companies would take a mixture of granite dust and epoxy and simply fill in what was wrong and then carve over it. But over time, that washes or weathers away. Now, in this case, I think they just completely filled in a marker that somebody declined or was wrong, and they created a new marker, but we don't know if it's Elvin Trotter or George Webb. We don't know which date. You cannot tell which came first. and sometimes the mistakes are just so, like, so the word dad is carved as Dida by mistake. So that would be an example of some lies on a tombstone. Other times it's just a matter of doing a little research. Carlotta Reagan was born on the first day of the week, the month, and the year. But if you look online, 1799, the first day of the week was the first day of the year was a Tuesday. So maybe a family story that got handed down. Or little Joe Abels, born in November, dies in February of the same year. Did they flip the two dates? Should it have been 1917? Is it completely wrong? We don't know. My calendar doesn't work that way. Hard to say what the story was with little Joe Abels. But here you can see the dates are backwards or somehow wrong. Now, sometimes when a mistake was carved on a stone, family didn't correct the original stone, but they would correct the next stone of the next person to die. This is a husband and wife, and you can see that the markers were probably made by the same carver, and the husband and wife died 3 years apart. So the wife died first, and her marker, excuse me, I'm trying to see my own screen here. Okay. The wife's marker has got a lot of information. We know her name was Eliza Ann. We know when she came to Arkansas. Well, it says moved to Arkansas, M-O-O-V-E-D, moved to Arkansas, and her husband's name and their marriage date. 3 years later, her husband died, and all these corrections appear. First of all, her name is spelled differently. It's Alicia now, E-L-I-C, or Eliza with a different spelling. And it's now moved to Boone County, not just Arkansas, but to the county. And I think he wants credit for time served because the wedding date is now a year earlier. Instead of 1866, it's 1865, and the day is moved from August, I can't read it on my screen, but to the 17th. So a lot of corrections. Rather than correcting the original stone, they simply wait till Dad dies and they put the corrections there. So all of this has to do with mistakes or lies or inconsistencies on stone. My question is, can you trust a photograph? Do they ever lie to us? Now you would think I had photoshopped this, right? That is how Bordelac looks on his marker. I have not done a thing to that marker. I'm just in awe of the family. That's his portrait. The thing is, though, that when those little photo ceramics, those little discs were made, there was an opportunity for the company to do some early photoshopping. Photography is invented, what, in like the 1830s? The first patent for securing daguerreotypes on monumental stones comes along in 1851. And somebody figures out how to get the family to send a copy of a photo. They transfer it onto a little disc of ceramic. And then, there's going to be some places that didn't transfer very well. So in the factory, they will take a pen and ink or black paint, and they will fix the places that are too light. I think a lot of times it's the pupils. Perhaps the person had blue eyes, and it just doesn't transfer well. Now, this man is slowly fading away, but his pupils and his hair will be with us forever. And if you find older photoceramics, it's really good to look at them closely because so many of them have been doctored. The man at the top in the middle, look at his hat. I mean, this is not a very good job, or else there's just been a lot of damage. But a lot of times it is the pupils, a hat. I think the man in the middle actually has a lot of ink added to him. Now again, Photoshop. How did it exist from an early date? This picture comes from a book called Forgotten Faces, and it's a history of photoceramics. All the pictures come from California. And if you notice, something was removed from that photograph. It looks like a paw, if you ask me. It's probably a hand. But there are examples of early photos where somebody has tried to remove details. Now, I love finding these examples. I think these are, I guess you could say, early Photoshop. All of these couples, none of them were in the same room when the pictures were taken. And it's, you'd think that maybe they could have sized them a little better. But these are just a few examples of looking at studio portraits were expensive. You had one of each person, so you combine them for their shared tombstone. We still do it, of course, on modern markers, and I love finding examples, mainly when you have a family group, when you have a family reunion and you want to be sure that everybody is represented. Which child was not there when that picture was taken? Not the only example I found. That's one of the better ones. Sometimes the extra person sort of floats in midair, like do a little cut and paste. And of course, it's always possible to add your relative to, well, anybody's picture. Well, now for some absolute whoppers. And these men actually, I'm sure, did catch those fish. I just kind of imagining the stories they told back at the dinner table. But the whoppers I want to tell you about are not tombstones so much as they are cemeteries that are lying. Okay. This stone was put up in 2015 by a group from the Grand Prairie Historical Society. And they're marking the grave of Pierre Laclede. He went by Laclede. Legeste was a legal addition. It is true that he was the founder of St. Louis. And he did die in 1778, but nothing else about this is accurate. After they put this marker in the cemetery, and it's just down the road from Arkansas Post, after they created this marker, they cleaned up the cemetery, and they put up a marker at the entrance that now says 1778, oldest cemetery in Arkansas. And this one bothers me because this story has taken on legs. If you are at the state line, there'll be tourism brochures that will tell you that Skull Cemetery is the oldest cemetery in Arkansas. Atlas Obscura, I think, has had it. Facebook has had it. And the fact is that Pierre Laclede was not buried there, and it was not that hard to find out because there were newspaper accounts. So let me tell you just quickly about Pierre Laclede and where he is buried, because I'm really proud of this. He was a Frenchman who came to this country and settled in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he met a woman named Marie Chateau. She had a son. Her husband had abandoned her, and she and Pierre entered into a common law marriage that produced 4 children. Now, at some point, Pierre and his stepson, Auguste, did found the city of St. Louis. They needed a trading post because Pierre had the exclusive rights to buy fur from Native Americans along a certain stretch of the Mississippi, and it made him very wealthy. But at some point, he lost that charter, and he went into debt, and now he had to recoup. He had 4 children with Marie and so forth. So he decides to, they're living in St. Louis, so he decides to go back to New Orleans. Okay, there's St. Louis, and there's New Orleans, and he's going down the Mississippi in the spring. So spring floods, this is fast water. This is before the steamboat era, so he's going in a flat-bottom boat, and when he gets to New Orleans, he loads it up with goods, because this is the be-all and end-all of culture. Ships are coming in from other countries, and he gets rum and I think some books and some linen, some fabrics. And now he's got the arduous job of going upstream against the current to get back to St. Louis so he can sell all these goods. He does this through hard manual labor with the use of boatmen. The boatmen would row, they would pole, they would use a cordel, which is a long rope, they would tow, they would tie off the cordel and pull the boat. So this was incredibly difficult. But they worked their way back upstream in, again, the spring against a really heavy current. And about halfway there, Pierre dies of a fever right at the mouth of the Arkansas River, or very close to where the Arkansas River feeds into the Mississippi. Now, we know this because Arkansas Post at that time was only 7 miles upstream. It was going to move the following year to where it is now. But in that year, the post was only 7 miles away, and the boatman got word to the commandant, Balthazar de Villiers, and he was not just the commandant, he was the coroner, and he had to go look at the body. On the morning of May 27th, he floats the 7 miles downstream on his barge, looks at Pierre and says, natural causes, and then proceeds to make an inventory of Pierre's boat, because the coroner gets to take up something for the crown. Now, the boatmen have got to bury their boss, and we don't know when he died, and May is hot weather in Arkansas, so that body may have been unburied for a day or two, and they bury him at the mouth of the river. There was a bench of land with very soft soil, and if it wasn't already a graveyard, which I think it was a heavily trafficked area, it quickly became one, because the town of Napoleon gets put in this spot, and Napoleon will use this as their town cemetery, and there'll be a marine hospital at Napoleon for the boatmen who have such hard lives and so forth. So Pierre is buried there, and about 9 or 10 years later, one of his sons is shown the spot by the very boatman who buried the father. So we know where Pierre is buried. This is a satellite view of the Mississippi River, and the Arkansas River, where it feeds in, has changed course for a variety of reasons. So that's the old course of the Arkansas River, and that is where the bench is and the cemetery where the body was buried, and then ultimately there are probably about 2,000 bodies. The soil was such easy digging that when steamboats came along, and if a boat captain had picked up passengers in New Orleans that, say, died on board from an epidemic, he'd have to bury them in a hurry. They didn't take bodies back home. And they would go out of their way to reach this graveyard because the ground was so soft. Now, Pierre never had a tombstone. Nobody had a tombstone early on, but eventually there was a monument dealer at Napoleon, and there were actual tombstones. Luckily for me, some men visited the graveyard back in 2009 and left a blog, which they gave permission for people to use. Napoleon is now an island. This spot has been cut off by the river, so you have to go by boat or by plane to get there. They went by boat, and this is two of them walking up onto that bench where the graveyard still is, and this is the only really large tombstone that's left. Probably shipped in from New Orleans or down from Memphis. There are probably 3 other tablet-style stones, and in 1940 an archaeologist visited and probed and said he found evidence of tombstones. So clearly graves were marked there. Lots and lots of them washed away. There were multiple floods. The flood that eventually washed away the town of Napoleon took out part of the graveyard, and the river would periodically flood. So lots of graves did wash away, and perhaps Pierre washed away too, but the graveyard technically still exists. And so the people that put up that marker got one thing right. Wherever Pierre Laclede is or was buried is Arkansas's oldest graveyard, and that would be the one on Napoleon Island, even though it's not accessible. Well, another graveyard that is just lying its butt off is this one in Madison County. And this story makes me crazy. I live in Madison County. This is Kilgore, which has a grave house, which are extremely rare. It's falling in, but it's one of the few grave houses left in Arkansas. But and it's a very isolated place. Well, about a decade ago, a local woman, took it upon herself to start marking the graves there. I'm going to call her Hattie. That was her name, actually. I don't remember her last name. Hattie decided that she was going to make concrete markers, and she also believes that concrete will last longer than stone. So she went around putting up markers for people. So, for example, Elias Witter has a perfectly good existing concrete marker, but Hattie decided that a wife must be buried next to her husband, so she made this. Doing no research. Now, Nancy moved on after her husband died, and she was buried in California, different year, different date, has a perfectly good marker. So this is one example of Hattie's work in the cemetery. Somebody told me about 40% of the markers in the cemetery now are completely wrong and cannot be trusted. I think the number may actually be higher. Earl and Pearl, twin sons. Well, you know, it looks like they died as infants. News to them, they both served in the Second World War. And their dates are completely, they weren't born in December of 1919, according to their actual markers. Even worse, Hattie started removing markers because she thought they were obscene. This one, she believes the word puss is obscene. It's short for Priscilla. So she hauled that off the grave along with Puss's husband's marker, and she smashed it, she said, by mistake, and she made him this nice replacement. So all throughout Kilgore Cemetery is Hattie's work. Now, she was stopped. This is inside, I think, the park, and they sent a couple lawyers to put the fear into her, and she said she was just doing a good thing, and her markers were so much better than what was there. I don't know if she ever put Puss's marker back on her grave. It was in her garage at the time where they stopped her. And meanwhile, a monument company has delivered a marker to the cemetery, and they got the wrong Kilgore Cemetery. It doesn't even belong. The person was never buried there. So for all these reasons, if you go to Kilgore, you cannot trust pretty much everything that's there. In fact, where there are existing markers, she made people new ones, and she changed things. C.W. Jones became George Jones. His death date of 1852 became 1863. Corrine Cleo Flynn becomes Cora Bivens Flynn on her marker, and so on and so forth. And these are just the ones I know of. So over and over again, Hattie has been working her way across the cemetery. Well, I want to talk just briefly about avoiding making mistakes, because tombstones have so many things on them that can trip us up. Our ancestors knew what they were putting on a marker, but sometimes we don't understand it now. Time has passed. It's really easy to look at certain things and misinterpret something, and then we go and put something into print, or heaven forbid, on a big modern marker, and it's avoidable. So I'm just going to hit a couple of high points here. I don't have time to talk symbolism, but this is one symbol that tends to really upset people. Captain John Scott is in Russellville Cemetery. I was just there yesterday. Woman marker, a stone marker, and she's got an anchor leaning up against her leg. Well, unfortunately, this and the name Captain, because he served in the Civil War, made somebody think that he was a sea captain. And so this beautiful article appeared on Russellville Cemetery, and in it they talk about sea captain, Captain Scott, when in fact he was a lawyer, a farmer, a merchant, and a newspaper editor, and he was also the clerk of the circuit clerk, county clerk, probate clerk, and is also a state senator. He never went to sea, however. So the anchor simply represents hope. And we find anchors everywhere. Small children have anchors, old people have anchors. The anchor represents the hope of salvation, the hope of heaven, the hope that we'll see our loved ones again. There are three theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. And when they're represented as women, they usually hold something to tell us who they are. Faith holds a cross or a Bible and points upward. Hope always has an anchor. It's like, you know, the voyage through life is a voyage across the ocean. You don't drop anchor in the middle. You drop anchor when you're in port, heaven, destination. So all of these are just examples. A dove on top of an anchor. Anchors combined with other symbols. It simply means hope. Language can trip people up. The word relict is a good example. Relict simply means a leftover, a survivor. And this stone is really telling us. It says she's the relict of J. Monger, deceased. To be a relict, your spouse has to have died and you have not remarried. Very archaic language. You don't see this very often. Consort, you see a lot oftener. Just recently on Facebook, there was a controversy over the word consort, so somebody insisted that it meant that they were living in sin. It doesn't. It simply means a spouse. And of course, in English royalty, the consort is the non-reigning monarch, the spouse of the monarch. But consort does show up fairly often. It just means the husband or wife, and men can be consorts. I had somebody argue with me one time that it also meant concubine, and it doesn't. So one other archaic word is the word ashes. This man was the last person legally hanged in Boone County for a crime he may or may not have committed, and it has gone online on ghost hunting sites that he was cremated because it says, "Here rests the ashes of." It's simply ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Arkansas didn't have a crematorium until 1974. Nobody was cremating this far back. I talked to an undertaker once who said, well, occasionally a family would want cremation, and he would have to drive the body to St. Louis or to Memphis. Those are the nearest places. So nobody in Arkansas was cremating at this early a date, but you do find the word ashes on tombstones. So one other place that things that really can trip people up are fraternal lodge emblems. The fraternal lodges, and just between the end of the Civil War and the Depression, there may have been as many as 2,000 different fraternal lodges in this country. I mean, we know about the Masons, the Oddfellows, and Knights of Pythias, but there were some that came and went so quickly we really don't know what their symbols mean. For example, I mean, these are all actually known, but these are some of these are fairly rare. The Order of Pyramids. I found it in Arkansas, but I don't really know what they did. Some are Masonic, the snake biting its own tail, that's the Mosaic Templars, which was an African-American fraternal lodge founded here in Little Rock, and the two founders are buried in Oakland Fraternal, and so forth. When you find something out of the ordinary on a marker and you think it's weird, it's probably a fraternal lodge emblem that's been left. For example, this showed up something like this on Facebook recently. A young woman in full goth outfit, found a Eastern Star and thought it was a pentagram. She was very excited. It's simply the Eastern Star is the Women's Lodge of the Masons. They also use this, fatal, and it does not mean dead. It stands for fairest among thousands, altogether lovely. I can't explain it, but it's a Masonic creed or something used for wives. And then this one, which is the Daughters of Rebecca, the Women's Lodge of the Oddfellows. I had somebody ask me if it was satanic because there are 7 stars and a dove and a crescent moon. And you remember the whole controversy over the Procter & Gamble logo at one time? Simply the Women's Lodge of the Rebeccas. So fraternal lodge emblems take all different shapes and forms. They modify over time. The Woodmen of the World got simpler. They dropped a few elements. The elk, the AOUW, Ancient Order of United Workmen, they're defunct. But over and over again, you will find emblems that show that that person was a member of fraternal lodge. African-American lodges have their own very distinctive emblems. Again, Mosaic Templars and the Supreme Royal Circle of Friends were both founded in Arkansas. There are black Oddfellows and the Women of the Rebeccas, but I mean the white lodge, the Women of the Rebeccas. But in the black lodge, the women are the Household of Ruth, and they use crossed sheaves of wheat as their emblem. And down in the lower right corner, the Grand Court Order of Calanthe, if I'm pronouncing that right, those are the Women's Lodge of the Knights of Pythias, whereas the white lodges, the women are the Pythian sisters. So there are some differences, there are some similarities. The hand holding the rose was sort of new to me. I had seen this before, not realizing that if you're in an African-American cemetery, you are looking at a lodge emblem, but if you're in a white cemetery, you're just looking at iconography. So I just took that one recently. Very, very similar, but totally different meanings. 3 lodges, though, that are, when you get into this new territory, the nativist territory, it gets much darker. There were 3 different lodges called nativist, and that meant they were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. They believed in protecting the interests of the native born. They do not hire, vote for, or buy from immigrants, and that also included Jews, Jews, Catholics. And the idea that persons born in a country are more important than ones coming from somewhere else. So, the Patriotic Order, Sons of America, did not get established in Arkansas, although there was an attempt. I saw a classified ad trying to start a lodge. As far as I know, this did not exist in Arkansas. The Junior Order of United American Mechanics, a JOUAM, junior doesn't mean anything. They are all over Arkansas, usually in places where you have coal mines, where you have immigrant labor coming in. They are hiding behind the Masonic emblem. They were very secretive. And in fact, if you go on Find a Grave, especially in Scott County, over and over again it will say, person has a Masonic emblem, when actually they have JOUAM. The women were the Daughters of America. And that one is defunct now. And then there are the Red Men. This is maybe my favorite of the 3 because I gave a talk once and I said, Red Men were nativist, and if you have one of these on great-grandpa's tombstone, it does not mean that you are Native American. And I had a very angry little old lady come up to me afterwards and insist that it did mean that, and her grandmother was a Pocahontas, and that proved it. The Red Men were whites only until 1974, and I think they may be defunct now, or there may be a lodge or 2. But what's confusing here is that they met in tribes. So you can find a red man marker and it will say member of the Kiowa tribe or the such and such tribe. And that seems to further cement in people's minds that great-grandpa was Native American. Their goal was to perpetuate the traditions of a vanished race. So if great-grandpa was a member of the Red Men, then he was passing for white. So, Red Men, they changed their logo at some point to an eagle, and they kept the which is totem of the eagle, part of their creed, I guess. And the Women's Lodge was the degree of Pocahontas, although I've never found that on a tombstone. But there are quite a few Red Men lodges there were in Arkansas. If you want to know what they looked like when they were meeting, this is Eureka Springs. They were meeting in the Oddfellows Hall, and there's another picture of them on horseback in a procession. So All of these are examples of lies or ways to not put mistakes into print, but I left out one more category, and that is humor. People doing something deliberately funny on a marker. Now, it's not a lie, but someday, down the road, people may see these markers and really wonder what we were up to. Now, the guy that said he was hated and feared by most, I'm assuming he was making a joke. I hope he was making a joke. But we don't know, and someday no one will know. This woman, is she on a giant rabbit? Is it Photoshop? Does she have a sense of humor? She loved hats. We know that about her. But the number one joke that keeps popping up is, I told you I was sick. I have people tell me they find this, they love it. I actually saw this marker for a man who isn't dead yet, but he knows that he's got his marker in place, and it says, I told you I was sick, with his name. This shows up, these are just ones in Arkansas, and you find them all over the country. People love this one, apparently. You know how there's a saying, no one ever says on their deathbed, I wish I'd spent more time at the office? Well, apparently this woman wished she could have worked one more day. But my favorite example, I'm going to end with this one, my favorite example of all time is this, and I just visited him yesterday too in Conway. Tony Griffin Sherrod died fending off a great white shark during a triathlon. I thought it was serious. I went home the first time I saw him. I Googled deaths from great white sharks. There is a page on the internet. He is not on it. He died, according to his obituary, he died of colon cancer. So a family joke, how he would have preferred to die. He was a triathlete, though. He competed a lot. But the great white shark part of the inscription is, I assume, is humor. So this is my email address. If you're out in a graveyard and you find something inexplicable, something you want to share with me, you find an emblem that I could help you with, or an inscription, a poem, a carver's signature, send me a picture. I live for this. I really love helping figure out what's going on with the marker. Symbolism, although Holly is also an authority on tombstone symbolism. And if you are out there and you find something really wonderful and you just want to share it with me, please do. I'm looking for tombstones of amputated body parts, tombstones that give the name of a murderer or a cause of death, somebody buried with their pet. I mean, just something out of the ordinary. I'm always collecting interesting examples for future talks. So thank you all very much.